We're gonna start with the ones that are recognized and pretty well known, like schizotypal personality disorder or narcissism, and then we're gonna end up at the bottom layer of this iceberg, which are just rare and odd ones, like walking corpse syndrome. Whatever that is, we'll learn later. But no more wasting time, join my Discord if you want to hang out with me, subscribe to the channel if you want more videos, and follow my Instagram, just because. Also, I'll take right now to say that when I say interesting, I don't want to make light of anybody who has to deal with these, because obviously my heart goes out for anyone who has to deal with any of these. I don't want to make light of it, I don't want to make fun of people who have these, I just think it's really interesting to learn about the brain, and it's always good to be more educated, and it's just interesting. So yeah, let's get more into this. First up, we got schizotypal personality disorder. This might look at a glance like the quirky cousin of schizophrenia. It sits on the same family tree, but it doesn't usually reach the same level of hallucinations or paranoia. People with schizotypal traits often have odd beliefs or magical thinking, like feeling certain that they can predict events or read hidden messages in everyday things. Imagine someone convinced that their grandmother's old spoon has the power to change tomorrow's weather just by being placed on the windowsill. It's not quite out there as a full psychotic episode, but it shows the subtle break from everyday logic that defines this disorder. Historically, psychiatrists noticed that some patients who had these eccentric beliefs and awkward social behaviors didn't quite fit into the stark categories of psychosis or mood disorders. The term schizotypal evolved partly from a push by early 20th century psychiatrists to capture that in-between zone, a realm of symptoms that were schizo-like but milder. Eugene Bleuler, a key figure in early schizophrenia research, was big on the idea that there could be a spectrum of disorders related to schizophrenia, one that included less dramatic symptoms. Over time, researchers refined these ideas, realizing that there is a meaningful difference between a fleeting odd thought and the deeper fixed beliefs or perceptual oddities that you see in schizotypal personalities. From a science standpoint, there's decent evidence of genetic links to schizophrenia. Some folks with schizotypal personalities may share genetic markers or brain differences with those who develop full-blown psychosis. MRI scans sometimes show slight variations in brain areas related to social and emotional processing, and it seems like their brains might be wired to misinterpret certain signals. For example, a random noise or a passing shadow might spark a twinge of paranoia or a sense of uncanny significance. Meanwhile, their odd beliefs can act like a mental magnet, drawing them further into unorthodox explanations of the world around them. Socially, schizotypal personality can feel isolating because it's tough to mesh with groups when you're constantly sensing hidden meanings that no one else can pick up on. Picture trying to hang out with your classmates or coworkers while you're preoccupied with what color someone's shirt might mean about the future. People who have schizotypal traits often report feeling lonely or misunderstood, partly because they seem distant or awkward, and partly because others might get weirded out by their unusual comments or mannerisms. Treatment tends to be less about eliminating those beliefs and more about helping the individual function better, building social skills, reducing anxiety in public settings, and learning how to reality check those odd thoughts before they spiral. Therapists might use approaches similar to what's used in early psychosis intervention, like gently challenging some beliefs and explaining how certain thought patterns form. Medication, if used, usually involves low-dose antipsychotics to dial down any paranoid or borderline psychotic symptoms. The main goal is to keep those eccentricities from turning a person's everyday life into a constant minefield of misunderstandings and stress. Next up, we got dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. That older name conjures images of dramatic Hollywood stories like Sybil or The Three Faces of Eve, which captured the public's imagination with the idea of a single person flipping like a switch between completely different personalities. But outside the spotlight, a deeper and more nuanced story exists, especially in the realm of psychology. The leading theory suggests that DID develops as a self-protective tactic when a child faces repeated, intense trauma before they've fully formed a sense of self. It's like their mind creates safe rooms where parts of their identity can go to escape the worst of the pain. Over time, these safe rooms become more defined, and the result is multiple identity states or alters, each holding pieces of the person's memories, emotions, or ways of interacting with the world. Some alters might be brash and fearless, and others might be childlike and vulnerable, and still others focused on a specific skill or way of thinking. Historically, there's been a lot of debate in psychology over whether these alters are actual separate identities or if they're more like different facets of one identity that got walled off from one another. In the 1980s and early 90s, diagnoses of multiple personality disorder shot up, leading some critics to claim overdiagnosis or therapeutic suggestion, where eager therapists might have accidentally encouraged patients to uncover hidden identities. Then came the switch in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, from multiple personality disorder to dissociative identity disorder. This was a change that tried to emphasize how this is more about dissociation, or disconnecting your core sense of self, rather than truly becoming different people. Neuroscience has pitched in too. Studies using fMRI scans show that when people with DID shift between alters, there can be distinct changes in brain activity patterns. It's almost as though each part of the brain's wiring lights up differently, hinting that these different identity states aren't just pretend or purely a product of imagination. Some researchers interpret this as the brain sectioning off traumatic memories in a way that protects the individual from emotional overload. Critics say more studies are needed, but there's a growing consensus that DID is real, and it can't just be chalked up to acting or suggestion. For those living with DID, daily life can involve memory gaps, sudden switches in mood or perception, and the unsettling feeling of losing time. One moment they might be shopping for groceries, and the next they're home with bags on the counter, having no recollection of leaving the store or the drive back. Because alters may hold distinct memories and emotional triggers, it's like someone's internal dialogue takes place among multiple voices, each stepping to the forefront when they feel the need to protect or express something crucial. Therapeutically, the approach focuses less on forcing all alters to merge into one, and more on helping the individual function cohesively, communicate internally, and process the root traumas. Technique might include talking directly to different alters, teaching them coping skills, and revisiting traumatic memories in a controlled, supportive environment so they're less overwhelming. Sometimes the goal is integration, where alters unite into one primary identity, but it can also be about achieving cooperation among these parts so the person can live without constant interruptions or emotional avalanches. Alright, next up we got narcissistic personality disorder. This is basically that next level of self-obsession that goes way beyond posting too many selfies or fishing for compliments on social media, which, by the way, again, follow my Instagram because that is exactly what I do. In ancient Greek mythology, Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection. He literally couldn't look away. Fast forward to modern psychology, and you've got a clinical condition characterized by an inflated sense of self, a hunger for admiration, and a painful lack of genuine empathy. Psychologists started pinning it down as a diagnosable disorder back in the mid-20th century, but the idea of people being way too into themselves has been around forever. The difference with NPD is that it's not just about arrogance, it's the lengths to which people will go to protect that grandiose self-image. They might brag nonstop, put others down, or act like rules are beneath them. Anything to keep that ego balloon floating. Underneath all that swagger, though, there's usually a very fragile self-esteem. It's like a balloon filled with helium. Flashy on the outside, but one sharp poke of criticism can deflate it fast. From a scientific angle, some studies hint that people with NPD show different patterns of brain activity in areas related to empathy and emotional regulation. This doesn't mean they're all just like wired to be mean. It suggests that there might be a neurological piece to why it's hard for them to read the room or to connect with others' feelings. Of course, environment and upbringing also play a massive part too. A childhood where someone was either excessively pampered, like, you're the best kid ever and nobody else matters, or constantly criticized can both set the stage for narcissistic traits to take hold. Unlike something as dramatic as dissociative identity disorder, where you've got like whole alternate identities, NPD is more about that persistent vibe of I'm the star, you're the extras. You think you're the main character. People with NPD often struggle in relationships because real connection, guess what, requires empathy and mutual respect. Two things in short supply when you're always chasing approval or trying to prove that you're superior. At the same time, it can be incredibly hard for them to admit anything's wrong. After all, if you're basically perfect, why would you ever need help? Therapy can make a real difference though. Approaches like the psychodynamic therapy or cognitive behavioral techniques can help people become more aware of their narcissistic traits, understand where they came from, and learn how to relate to others in a more authentic way. Granted, it takes time and a strong willingness to do some major introspection. Challenging for anyone, but especially for someone whose whole MO is to look invincible. Next up, we got delusional disorder. Delusional disorder is all about having these rock-solid beliefs that defy reality, but without the full-on hallucinations or wild behavior that you might see in something like schizophrenia. It's like someone's holding onto a storyline in their head. Maybe that they're being followed by undercover agents, or that a secret admirer is leaving messages in random song lyrics. And no matter what evidence you bring, they're not giving it up. The really interesting part is that, aside from these unshakable convictions, people with delusional disorder can seem totally normal in most everyday situations. Historically, psychiatrists used to lump these kinds of paranoid or rigid beliefs under broader psychosis. But in the late 19th century, doctors like Emil Kraepelin started noticing that some people had more isolated, specific delusions. No big symptoms, no major personality changes, just that one core belief that was unbreakable. Fast forward to now, and delusional disorder has its own section in diagnostic manuals. You'll often hear about subtypes too, like the erotomanic type, where someone's convinced a celebrity or random stranger is secretly in love with them, or the grandiose type, where the person believes that they have some world-changing talent or mission that no one else can recognize. Neuroscience doesn't have all the answers on what sparks delusional disorder, but there are hints that it might involve the way certain brain circuits handle information, specifically how we process rewards, threats, and unexpected events. Some researchers point to dopamine dysregulation, which also crops up in other psychotic disorders, but the difference here is that someone with delusional disorder isn't typically plagued by hallucinations or disorganized thoughts. Instead, it's like their brain zeroes in on one single idea and just won't let it go, no matter how much it clashes with outside reality. Living with delusional disorder can be surprisingly high functioning. Many people keep up a job, hang with friends, and go about daily life without causing a stir. The delusion might not pop up until it's triggered, like when the supposed follower drives by in a truck and that looks vaguely familiar. Then that belief about being tracked or conspired against or whatever the fuck it may be flares up again, and any attempt to reassure them it's just a random driver might be a dead end. Treatment-wise, antipsychotic meds can help dial back the intensity of the delusion, but one big challenge is that people with delusional disorder often don't think they need help. If you genuinely believe the neighbor is shooting laser beams through your wall, why would you want therapy for paranoia that you're certain isn't paranoia at all? That's where therapists that are skilled in building trust and gently challenging these fixed ideas come in, sometimes using a technique known as motivational interviewing to open the door for possible doubt. Alright, and that was layer 1. Let's get into layer 2. These are rare and more specific disorders. And starting from here, I have not heard of absolutely any of these. So this is where it really starts to get crazy, guys. So we're gonna start with Cotard syndrome. Cotard syndrome is a rare mental health condition where a person firmly believes that they're dead, dying, or missing vital organs, like their heart or brain. They might say things like, "I don't exist," or "I'm basically a corpse," and genuinely mean it. Back in the late 1800s, a French neurologist named Jules Cotard described this phenomenon as, okay, this is French, bear with me guys, de l'ère des négations. I did not say that right, but whatever. It basically translates to the delirium of negation. Ever since, psychiatrists and neurologists alike have tried to figure out why this extreme disbelief in one's own existence crops up. People with Cotard syndrome often deal with severe depression or other major psychiatric or neurological issues. Brain scans sometimes show glitches in regions that handle recognition, self-awareness, and emotion, which can fuel that eerie feeling of non-existence. It's more than just a passing thought. Some people might refuse to eat, bathe, or take any steps to preserve their health because, in their mind, what's the point if they're already gone? Historically, these cases pop up in medical journals like cautionary tales of how our minds can warp the concept of self under extreme stress or trauma. What makes Cotard syndrome so striking is that aside from believing they're dead, some individuals can function relatively normal in other areas of life. This disconnect highlights how powerful and specific delusions can be. Now, treatment for this can include a combination of antidepressants, antipsychotics, and sometimes electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. The biggest challenge is getting someone to recognize that they need help in the first place. If you're absolutely sure that you're fucking dead, seeking therapy might not even register as a priority at all. But with consistent help, many people do manage to reconnect with reality and to move past the delusion that they've already left this world behind, which, really thinking about it, is pretty sad. Next up we got Kagra syndrome. This sounds like the twist that's straight out of a fucking sci-fi thriller. Someone sees a loved one, maybe their parent, spouse, or best friend, and believes without question that this familiar face has been replaced with an identical lookalike. For people living with this condition, it's not just some casual suspicion. They genuinely feel that the person they're looking at is an imposter. Back in 1923, a French psychiatrist named Joseph Kagra first described the syndrome after observing a woman who insisted that various friends and family members had been swapped with doubles. Fast forward to modern neuroscience, and researchers have zeroed in on a possible glitch in the brain's facial recognition pathways, specifically those tied to emotional response. In a typical brain, when you see someone close to you, you not only recognize their face, you also get a warm, fuzzy feeling that confirms, yes, this is my person. With Kagra, there's a breakdown in that connection. The person can still recognize the face visually, like, yeah, that's definitely my mom's face, but that emotional spark is missing. And then without that gut-level reassurance, the brain basically goes, well, if this face doesn't feel like mom, it must be an imposter. Scientists often point to a disconnect between the fusiform face area, which helps us process and identify faces, and the limbic system, which is our emotional hub. Brain injuries, dementia, or certain psychiatric conditions can trip up those connections. One real-world example involves patients who might calmly greet their fake parent and then freak out about how the real one must be like tied up in a basement somewhere. The rational side of them can't override that eerie sense that something's off. Treating Kagra syndrome can be tricky because the delusion feels so real to the person experiencing it. Doctors might try antipsychotic meds if there's an underlying psychotic disorder, or they might focus on therapy techniques to help the person cope with and test their beliefs against reality. In some cases, addressing the root cause, like improving blood flow or managing dementia, can reduce the intensity of Kagra symptoms. It's proof that our brains do more than just show us who's in front of us. They also give us that deep down sense of familiarity. When that emotional link snaps, we're left with a storyline that seems bizarre to everyone else, but rings true to the person caught in it. Our next up we got Diogenes syndrome. Diogenes syndrome centers around an extreme level of self-neglect, hoarding, and overall disinterest in one's personal environment. The name itself is a nod to Diogenes of Sinope, an ancient Greek philosopher who famously slept in a giant jar and shunned social norms. Ironically though, Diogenes the Cynic was more about rejecting materialism and vanity, whereas Diogenes syndrome is usually about being completely overwhelmed by clutter and neglect. Despite the philosophical sounding label, the condition is less about any grand statement and more about a breakdown in basic self-care. You'll typically see it in older adults who live alone and end up isolating themselves from friends, family, or any outside help. These individuals might let trash pile up to the rafters, avoid bathing for weeks on end, and refuse medical attention even if they're clearly unwell. In medical literature, this has sometimes been called senile squalor syndrome, or social breakdown syndrome, highlighting how it's often linked to a broader collapse of someone's social and physical well-being. Scientists and mental health pros have dug into possible causes and found no single smoking gun. Instead, it might crop up alongside other issues like dementia, depression, or certain personality disorders. The short version is that the person loses the motivation or ability to take care of themselves. Maybe because of a cognitive glitch, maybe because of crippling loneliness, or maybe both. One theory suggests that a trauma or major life event could trigger a spiral into neglect. The more the person withdraws, the harder it becomes to maintain even basic routines, and the more overwhelming it is to climb out of that pit. Neuroimaging studies are still pretty scarce because Diogenes syndrome isn't officially recognized as a standalone disorder in psychiatric manuals like the DSM. However, some clinicians think it might involve dysfunction in the frontal lobes, which control planning, judgment, and impulse regulation, the exact stuff you need to keep a tidy living space and maintain healthy habits. Treating someone with Diogenes syndrome can feel like an uphill battle. People in this state often don't see anything wrong or are flat out resistant to help. Social services might step in, especially if there's a serious health risk or the hoarding situation is a fire hazard, but you can't just swoop in and clean the place up and call it a day. Long-term solutions often require a mix of medical attention to rule out or manage any underlying conditions like dementia, mental health support, and ongoing social services to ensure that living conditions don't revert back to chaos. Next up, we got Othello syndrome. Othello syndrome, sometimes called morbid jealousy, is a type of delusional disorder where a person becomes convinced that their partner is cheating, despite zero evidence. The name comes straight from Shakespeare's tragedy Othello, where the main character spirals into destructive envy after being fed rumors of his wife's infidelity. If you haven't read it, or if you've only skimmed the spark notes, the short version is, Othello's jealousy takes over so completely that he ends up believing his innocent wife is unfaithful, leading to some seriously tragic consequences. It's no coincidence that psychiatrists picked up on this tale to describe a condition involving an all-consuming, and usually baseless, fear of betrayal. Historically, the concept of pathological or morbid jealousy has been recognized for ages. Even before modern psychiatry put a label on it, cases of jealous rage appeared in legal proceedings, medical reports, and of course, literary works. By the mid-20th century, mental health pros started narrowing down exactly how delusional jealousy looks in real life. People accusing their spouses of affairs without any solid proof, constantly demanding confessions, or interpreting totally normal events as evidence. Around that time, the term Othello syndrome began popping up, forever linking Shakespeare's tragic hero to this specific paranoid fixation. At a scientific level, some researchers suggest that Othello syndrome might involve a hyperactive threat detection system in the brain. Regions like the amygdala, which is the big player in fear and emotional reactivity, could be on high alert, scanning for the slightest sign of disloyalty. Meanwhile, the frontal lobes, which help us sort fact from fiction, may struggle to override those paranoid thoughts. Others point out that certain co-occurring issues like substance abuse or other psychiatric disorders can worsen jealous delusions. You might also see this condition linked to dementia or Parkinson's disease in older adults, which hints at a biological factor beyond just thinking too hard about possible cheating. People with Othello syndrome can become detective-level sleuths, checking phones, following their partner around, analyzing every text or social media like for clues. It's exhausting for everyone involved. In extreme cases, it can lead to threats or violence, which is why professionals take it seriously. Not just as a quirky quirk, but as a genuine delusional disorder that can ruin relationships and put people at risk. Treatment often takes a two-pronged approach. Medication, typically antipsychotics, can help dial down the delusional intensity, while therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, works on those thought patterns, helping the person see where they might be jumping to conclusions and how to cope with that extreme anxiety. Couples counseling can also help, but it's tricky because if one person is stuck in a delusion, they might not be on board for a "we have a problem" conversation in the first place. Even though Othello syndrome doesn't pop up in day-to-day talk as much as more familiar disorders, it's a stark reminder that jealousy isn't just a throwaway emotion. When it crosses the line into delusion, it can unravel a person's entire sense of reality, just like it did for Shakespeare's troubled hero centuries ago. And while we might not see it playing out on stage with sword fights and dramatic monologues, the modern version can be just as tragic, especially if that obsessive fear isn't recognized and treated before it sparks real-world damage. And that was Layer 2. Let's get into Layer 3 a little bit deeper now, starting with Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Alice in Wonderland syndrome might sound like a whimsical name, but it's actually a very real and sometimes unsettling neurological phenomenon where you perceive the world or your own body as shrunk, stretched, or otherwise distorted. Imagine looking at your hands and suddenly feeling like they're miles away, or that your bedroom has expanded into a massive cavern. It's named, of course, after Lewis Carroll's classic novel, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where Alice grows and shrinks in dramatic ways. And while the book came out in 1865, the syndrome wasn't described in medical literature until nearly a century later. A British psychiatrist named John Todd coined the term Alice in Wonderland syndrome in the 1950s after noticing that some of his patients Often migraine sufferers or individuals with epilepsy were having these bizarre perceptual shifts, seeing parts of their body or the environment as way bigger or smaller than normal. Carroll himself was known to have migraines, leading some historians and clinicians to wonder if his own experiences with visual distortions inspired those iconic drink me and eat me scenes in the novel. On a scientific level, the syndrome seems to revolve around temporary misfires in the brain areas responsible for processing visual and spatial information. Regions like the occipital lobe, which handles vision, and the parietal lobe, which helps you sense where your body is in space, may go briefly haywire. Think of it like a glitch in your internal mapping software. Because of that, people might see everyday objects like a doorknob or a spoon as impossibly small or ridiculously large. Sometimes time perception gets scrambled too, so minutes might feel like hours or vice versa. Although Alice in Wonderland syndrome can show up in adults, kids actually experience it more frequently, often around bedtime or early in the morning. They might suddenly run to their parents insisting their room looks like it's breathing or that their arms have grown so long they could reach the ceiling. It can be pretty freaky, but these episodes usually don't last long. Anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, though some people report it sticking around for a bit longer. Most cases are tied to migraines, epilepsy, or infections like mononucleosis. Treating the underlying cause, like managing migraines with medication, can sometimes reduce these strange illusions. However, there isn't a one-size-fits-all fix specifically for Alice in Wonderland syndrome itself. For many, it shows up randomly and then disappears just as mysteriously. Historically, it's fascinating to note that while Lewis Carroll's novel made this idea of shrinking and growing famous worldwide, the medical condition bearing its name didn't get official recognition until well after World War II. Before that, doctors probably just lumped these strange visual distortions under more general migraine or seizure symptoms. Now, Alice in Wonderland syndrome stands on its own in neurology textbooks as an intriguing, if rare, example of how perception can twist in ways that can feel downright surreal. So if you ever hear someone say that they literally felt like Alice, they're not just being dramatic. There's a real medical phenomenon where your sense of size and space can do a total 180, and it's every bit as mind-bending as Carroll's original Wonderland. Next up, we got reduplicative paramnesia. Reduplicative paramnesia is like stepping into your own personal twilight zone. You're 100% convinced that a familiar place, maybe your home or hospital you're in, has been perfectly duplicated somewhere else. You could be lying in a hospital bed, but you'd swear that you're actually in a different, identical hospital just a few miles away. It's a specific kind of mind warp that mixes memory, perception, and belief in a seriously bizarre way. Historically, the condition first popped up in medical literature back in the early 1900s thanks to doctors who noticed some patients making these out-there claims about copy-paste locations. One of the earliest documented cases involved a patient who firmly believed she was still in her hometown, even though she'd been transferred to a hospital in a completely different city. Over the decades, psychiatrists and neurologists started labeling it reduplicative paramnesia, slotting it among other disorders where reality gets bent, like the one we talked about earlier, Cogras syndrome. From a scientific standpoint, the leading idea is that it's triggered by a perfect storm of brain injuries or dementia-related changes, often in areas tied to memory and spatial recognition, like frontal lobe damage or problems in the right hemisphere. Because these regions handle how you map out your environment, any glitches in those circuits can crank out these uncanny beliefs. It's like your brain sees Hospital X, but it doesn't quite match up with the stored memory for Hospital X. So you end up assuming, well, this must be a new, identical hospital. People with reduplicative paramnesia can be totally chill about it, or they might get frustrated when nobody else goes along with their story. It's not always a scary experience for them, sometimes it's almost matter of fact. They'll say stuff like, oh yeah, this living room is a second version of mine, obviously, and then be baffled when their family looks at them like they're speaking nonsense. Treatment is more about managing the underlying condition, like Alzheimer's or any other brain-related issue, rather than trying to argue the person out of their belief. Therapists might use reality orientation techniques, gentle reminders, or even environmental adjustments to reduce confusion. But if the underlying dementia or brain injury is severe, that delusional framework can be pretty persistent. Next up, we got kluver-bucy syndrome. Kluver-bucy syndrome is a wild ride of behavioral changes caused by damage to certain parts of the brain, usually the amygdala and surrounding temporal lobes. Picture suddenly losing all your usual filters. You might become way too chill or fearless, start shoving random objects in your mouth, and get super interested in, well, anything that moves, if you know what I mean. It's definitely not your typical off day. Historically, the syndrome was first described in the 1930s by two researchers, Heinrich Kluver and Paul Bucy. They were studying rhesus monkeys and decided to remove part of the temporal lobe in an attempt to figure out how vision and emotion connect. To their surprise, the monkeys started acting super docile and unafraid, putting all sorts of stuff in their mouth, even things that normally freak out a monkey like snakes, plus a spike in random sexual behavior. Long story short, Kluver and Bucy realized they'd essentially stumbled upon a brand new syndrome. Since then, doctors have spotted similar symptoms in humans with bilateral temporal lobe damage, sometimes after severe head trauma, brain surgery, or conditions like a certain kind of herpes. On the science side, the amygdala is a major part of your brain's emotion center. Think of it as your internal alarm system that shouts, "Whoa, danger," when something sketchy happens. If it's compromised, that alarm either goes completely silent or starts misfiring. That explains why people, or monkeys, with kluver-bucy might wander fearlessly into risky situations or stay weirdly calm in moments that normally would have you in full panic mode. There's also something called, and this is the real name, hyperorality, which is fancy talk for I'm gonna put this random object in my mouth to figure out what it is, or hyperphagia, which means they might overeat, or at least constantly snack, because the usual I'm full signals aren't firing properly. Another piece of the puzzle is hypersexuality, where that normal sense of social or situational boundaries about sexual behavior just disappears, leading to awkward or outright inappropriate behavior. In day-to-day life, kluver-bucy syndrome can turn everything upside down, especially if the person is out in public. They might approach dangerous animals or strangers without a second thought, or start touching and tasting objects that are obviously not edible. Managing it usually means treating whatever caused the brain damage to begin with, like an infection or injury, and sometimes using medication to help dial down the impulsive or disinhibited behaviors. Therapy and strong social support can also help the person learn coping mechanisms and avoid risky scenarios. Even though it's pretty rare, kluver-bucy syndrome gives us a super clear lesson about how crucial the amygdala and temporal lobes are for regulating our impulses and keeping us safe. When that system glitches out, you lose the internal voice that tells you, don't do that, it's dangerous or socially awkward. Next up we got foreign accent syndrome, or FAS. This is exactly what it sounds like. You wake up one day, open your mouth to speak, and suddenly you sound like you're from a completely different country, even if you've never set foot there before. It's super rare, but it's been documented for over a century, and the stories behind it can be downright mind-boggling. One of the earliest recognized cases hails from the early 1900s, when a French neurologist noted a patient whose speech patterns flipped in a way that resembled an Alsatian accent. But the most famous early example probably dates back to World War II, involving a Norwegian woman who got hit in the head by shrapnel and suddenly started talking like she was German. Not exactly the best look in wartime Norway. At first glance, FAS can seem fake, like the person's just putting on an accent for attention or out of nowhere. But doctors who study the brain are pretty convinced there's a real neurological glitch going on. FAS usually shows up after some kind of trauma or injury to the parts of the brain that handle speech, often the language-dominant left hemisphere. Think strokes, head injuries, or even multiple sclerosis. When those regions get scrambled, something about the rhythm, intonation, or pacing of your speech changes. You might stretch vowels, clip consonants, or shift stress patterns in a way that happen to line up with a foreign accent. It's not that you suddenly downloaded a new language pack, but your normal speech just reboots in a foreign-sounding way. What's wild is that these new accents can vary. One day you might have a slightly British-sounding lilt, even though you're from the Midwest, and the next people say you switch to something vaguely French. Some documented cases are super specific, where a person from the United States starts sounding Jamaican even though they have zero connection to Jamaica. The phenomenon can be unsettling for the person experiencing it. Imagine losing part of your linguistic identity overnight. It can lead to awkward situations like getting side eyes from strangers who think you're faking it for kicks. From a science standpoint, FAS researchers dig into things like MRI or CT scans to see exactly what areas the brain got whacked. Prime suspects are often the motor speech areas like Broca's area, or regions that coordinate speech articulation and prosody, which is the melody of your speech. When these areas are damaged, your brain can't sync up all those tiny muscle movements in the mouth, tongue, and vocal cords in the way that it used to. The result is a distinctly foreign lilt, even if you're consciously not trying to produce it. Historically, FAS was sometimes written off as hysteria or malingering, which is faking for attention, which left early patients feeling misunderstood or even doubted by their own doctors. Over time, more thorough case studies and better imaging techniques proved that there really is a neurological basis for it. That said, it's still so rare that there's no universal playbook on how to treat it. Speech therapy can help people retain their mouths and vocal cords to get closer to their original accent, but success varies. Some individuals regain their old way of speaking completely, while others keep bits of the new accent for the rest of their lives. The emotional toll can be hefty too. Losing your native accent can feel like losing a piece of who you are, especially if it's tied to your community or cultural identity. Imagine having grown up in Texas your whole life and suddenly you can't sound Texan anymore. It can make you feel like a stranger in your own hometown. On the flip side, some people roll with it. There are stories of folks who lean into their new accent and even find it kind of fun once the initial shock wears off. But that reaction really depends on the individual and how they navigate everyday life with friends, family, and coworkers. And that was the end of Layer 3, guys. Let's get into the next layer, Layer 4. Starting with Jerusalem Syndrome. And again, this is Layer 4, so this is when they really start to get pretty weird. So Jerusalem Syndrome is one of those almost surreal conditions where people visiting or living in Jerusalem start experiencing intense religious-themed delusions or hallucinations. Think suddenly believing you're a prophet, dressing up in robes, or feeling called to deliver a sermon in the middle of the old city. It's not something you'd typically find in the DSM under its own category, but it's definitely recognized by mental health pros in Israel and beyond as a real, if rare, phenomenon. Historically, some of the earliest official notes on Jerusalem Syndrome trace back to the 1930s, when Dr. Heinz Hermann, one of the pioneers of psychiatry in Israel, described certain visitors to Jerusalem who had no previous history of mental illness, but suddenly started acting like they were biblical characters. They might roam the streets preaching, or in more extreme cases, give away their belongings and spout apocalyptic prophecies. Psychiatric hospitals in the area, particularly Kfar Shal in Jerusalem, ended up documenting a number of these cases over the decades. Psychiatrists noticed a pattern. For some people, stepping into a city drenched in religious significance could flip a switch in their psyche, triggering powerful spiritual visions or delusions. Scientifically, there's still debate about what exactly flicks that switch. One theory is that Jerusalem's intense religious and historical vibe overwhelms certain individuals, especially those who are already prone to anxiety, obsession, or underlying mental health issues. In this view, the city's holy sites and relentless spiritual energy act as like the perfect storm for a psychotic break. You've got the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, all cornerstones for major world religions. For someone with a shaky mental or emotional baseline, being surrounded by centuries of powerful religious symbolism can, in rare cases, push them into what looks like mania or psychosis. Clinically, professionals often break Jerusalem Syndrome into a few subtypes. One group includes visitors who already had a diagnosed mental illness before coming to the city, and the trip just aggravates their existing condition. And another group is made up of people who have no documented psychiatric background, but end up showing psychotic symptoms while in Jerusalem, typically driven by religious or spiritual themes. Interestingly, in many of these cases, once the person leaves Jerusalem and returns home, they snap back to their old self. It's like the city's ambiance is so charged that once you're removed from it, the delusions lose their grip. A classic example involves tourists who suddenly decide that they're on a divine mission, marching through the streets wearing sheets as tunics. Hospitals report that some individuals will even hole up in their hotel room preparing sermons that they feel compelled to deliver. One memorable case featured a man who believed that he was John the Baptist and headed to the Jordan River to baptize random strangers. who, to no one's surprise, were pretty confused. Treatment usually involves grounding the person in reality, which can mean short-term hospitalization, antipsychotic or anti-anxiety meds, and sometimes just gently ushering them out of the city's emotionally charged atmosphere. Local mental health workers know the drill. If a tourist shows up acting off the rails with biblical fervor, they'll try to de-escalate the situation before it spirals. Even though Jerusalem syndrome isn't super common, it's famous enough that local guides, police, and healthcare providers keep an eye out for it, especially during peak travel seasons like Easter or major Jewish holidays. It's a real testament to how a place saturated with history, conflict, and deep religious roots can have a powerful psychological impact on visitors. And while some people might brush it off as a quirky tourist meltdown, mental health professionals see it as another example of how complex and situational our minds can be. It's kinda crazy. Next up we got boanthropy. So boanthropy is one of those rare, almost legendary conditions where a person genuinely believes that they've turned into a cow, or at least behaves like one. You might hear about someone crawling around on all fours, munching grass, and acting like they belong out in a pasture instead of a house or a city street. As wild as it sounds, it's not just some mythological tale. There are a lot of actual cases of this. A famous historical reference pops up in the Bible's Book of Daniel, which describes King Nebuchadnezzar suddenly roaming the fields, eating grass, and letting his hair grow all scraggly like an animal. While we can't exactly swing by ancient Babylon to confirm it, many scholars believe that this might be the earliest written account of boanthropy. Over time, psychiatry has classified it as a form of zoanthropy, where someone thinks they become a type of animal, and it's closely related to cases like lycanthropy, which is the werewolf delusion. But boanthropy specifically zeroes in on cows, oxen, or other cattle. From a modern psychiatric perspective, boanthropy is about as rare as it gets. You won't find it highlighted in the DSM as its own separate category, and most mental health pros lump it in under delusional disorders or psychotic symptoms. Essentially, the person experiences such an intense break from reality that they start identifying with, and literally mimicking, cattle. If you zoom forward in history, references to humans living like beasts pop up now and then in medieval medical documents, though they often chalked it up to witchcraft, curses, or demonic possession. Actual clinical descriptions of boanthropy, however, didn't take shape until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when psychiatrists began systematically logging old delusions in published case studies. Even then, boanthropy was so rare, and still is, that these reports stood out like bizarre case study gems, giving early mental health pros a puzzle to ponder. The name itself merges Greek words, which is bous, which means ox or cow, and anthropos, which is human. So literally it means cowman, which I don't know if you care. I think the etymology is pretty cool. Modern psychiatrists suspect that a perfect storm of factors could spark boanthropy. Extreme stress, trauma, neurological issues, like a head injury or epilepsy, or underlying conditions like schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar, etc. The human mind is wild in its capacity to forge deeply held beliefs that contradict everyday reality. So it's pretty crazy. And then from a neurobiological standpoint, the idea is that certain brain regions could be misfiring, especially those involved in identity, body image, and self-perception. If emotional or cognitive regulation is already compromised, a symbolic or culturally charged image, in this case a cow, might take over that person's reality. It's similar to how some people with lycanthropy develop fierce convictions about having a wolf's body and instincts. Documented cases are extremely scarce, but when they surface, they often make headlines or find their way into journal articles. You might read about an individual who, in the midst of a severe mental health crisis, started crawling on all fours, avoiding human interaction, and grazing on grass. In certain rural areas where cattle are more common, there have been whispered stories of villagers who exhibit this behavior as well, though formal psychiatric follow-ups are rare, often due to lack of access or cultural stigma. This shit's fucking crazy that it even exists. This is like one of the most insane ones, I think. And it's fucking crazy that it's in the Bible too, bro. Like, come on. Next up, we have walking corpse syndrome, which you might remember from the beginning of this video. This is exactly what it sounds like. A person is straight up convinced they're dead, dying, or missing vital organs like their heart or their brain. Psychiatrists call it Cotard's delusion, but walking corpse syndrome sounds way more dramatic, so it kind of fits the vibe better. It's not super common, but when it strikes, it can be intense, with the affected individual totally sure that they're basically a walking zombie. Historically, the medical world started paying attention to this phenomenon back in the late 1800s, which we already kind of talked about, because this is actually a shoot-off of Cotard syndrome, which was in layer 2? Yeah, layer 2. So Jules Cotard wrote about patients who insisted they had no blood or believed that their insides were rotting away. One woman was so convinced she didn't have a brain that she refused to eat, figuring a corpse wouldn't need food. Walking corpse syndrome isn't in your face like some loud, active psychosis. People with this delusion aren't always hearing voices or seeing things. They're just 100% sure that they're dead. They might avoid eating, bathing, or going to the doctor because if you're already a corpse, why bother? Some have even been asked to be taken to the morgue, or gone to extremes to prove they're no longer among the living. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this one because we already kind of covered like the more basic one earlier, Cotard syndrome. But if you look at cultural takes on the phenomenon, you'll see echoes in folklore and superstitions where people believe they were undead or cursed. But modern psychiatry sees it as a legit condition. No voodoo, no horror movie script needed. It's basically your brain glitching so hard that it convinces you you're literally a corpse. And next up we have Stendhal syndrome. Stendhal syndrome is like an emotional overload that hits you when you're confronted with exceptionally beautiful art or overwhelming beauty. Picture this. You're wandering through a museum in Florence, you catch sight of a breathtaking painting or sculpture, and suddenly your heart's pounding, you feel dizzy, maybe even a little disoriented, and some people even claim they've fainted. It's kind of like an art lover's panic attack, and it's named after the 19th century French writer Stendhal, who famously described his own case of emotional breakdown while visiting Florence's Santa Croce church in 1817. Historically, people have called it by various names. Florence syndrome is another nickname because so many documented cases occur in Italian galleries or churches loaded with Renaissance masterpieces. Stendhal himself wrote about feeling like his senses were going haywire, his pulse sped up, and he was overcome by a feeling of, quote, celestial sensations. It caused quite a stir among art historians and psychologists, especially when modern tourists in Florence started reporting similar experiences. Shortness of breath, heart palpitations, even hallucinations, all triggered by the sight of iconic art. From a scientific angle, Stendhal syndrome lives in this gray area between a psychosomatic response and a cultural phenomenon. On the one hand, you've got the adrenaline rush that can come from being surrounded by centuries of creative genius. Think Michelangelo's David or Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and the emotional significance that art can hold. On the other hand, some experts see it as a form of suggestion or collective myth. People hear stories of others fainting at these art pieces and they unconsciously prime themselves for a dramatic reaction. Still, there's enough anecdotal evidence, cases reported to hospitals in Florence for instance, to suggest that something genuinely physiological might be happening. The combined impact of jet lag, culture shock, maybe dehydration, and the intense emotional jolt of seeing famous works up close. While Stendhal syndrome isn't officially recognized as a separate diagnosis in the DSM, it has a permanent spot in pop psychology. Local medical professionals in Florence have even put out warnings in travel guides, telling visitors to take breaks, stay hydrated, and pace themselves while exploring museums. Because hey, if you're on the 5th gallery of the day, you're sweaty and exhausted, and you suddenly come face to face with a painting you've admired your whole life, that emotional explosion can be pretty real. People who experience Stendhal syndrome typically recover pretty quickly once they're out of the situation, meaning the second that they step away from the artwork, the panic or dizziness often subsides. But for more intense episodes, medical staff or travel companions might help them calm down, rest, or even do something mundane like grab a snack to ground themselves. It's not usually a sign of deeper psychiatric condition, although if someone is highly prone to anxiety or panic attacks, the high stimulation environment of a packed Italian museum can push them over the edge. And that's the end of the iceberg, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. The editing's a little bit different this time, so let me know in the comments if you fuck with that or not. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed learning about all of these. Have a great night, everyone, and sweet dreams.